There's nothing quite like the feeling of being completely alone in this world, carrying a child you're not sure you can provide for. When 24-year-old Mariel pulled up to the rundown farmhouse her grandfather left her, she had $37 to her name and nowhere else to go. The neighbors in Hornburn had already made up their minds about the pregnant girl and the worthless property. The house was falling apart. The barn was ready to collapse. Everyone said her grandfather was just the town hermit who left her nothing but problems. But when Mariel walked through those creaky front doors and felt something she hadn't felt in months, hope, she decided to stay. Little did anyone know that beneath those overgrown fields lay a secret worth $120 million. What would you do if everyone counted you out, but you discovered you held the key to everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Honda's engine ticked as it cooled in the late afternoon silence, the only sound besides Mariel's careful breathing. She pressed both hands against her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her, as if sensing the uncertainty that had brought them here to this forgotten corner of rural Kansas. The farmhouse stood before them like a weathered monument to neglect. White paint peeled from its wooden siding in long curling strips that reminded Mariel of old scars. The front porch sagged under the weight of a roof that had seen too many seasons without repair. 3 broken windows stared back at her like hollow eyes, their glass replaced with cardboard and duct tape that fluttered weakly in the prairie wind. To the left, a red barn leaned precariously against its own shadow, its doors hanging open to reveal the darkness within. Rusted farm equipment dotted the overgrown yard like the bones of some long-dead mechanical beast. Weeds had claimed everything, pushing through the gravel driveway, wrapping around fence posts, and creating a green ocean that stretched toward distant hills. This was her inheritance. This was her fresh start. Mariel pulled the crumpled legal document from her purse, reading her grandfather's name one more time. Benjamin Ashworth Henderson. She'd only met him twice in her 24 years, both times before she turned 10, before the family arguments that split everyone apart and turned his name into something whispered with disappointment at holiday gatherings. Her mother had called him stubborn. Her father had called him a fool. Her ex-boyfriend's wealthy parents had called him irrelevant when they'd discovered his will named her as sole beneficiary. What could that old hermit possibly leave worth having? His mother had sneered during their final brutal conversation. The memory stung fresh as she climbed the porch steps, each board groaning under her weight. The front door key turned easily, too easily, as if the lock had given up years ago. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of golden light that slanted through windows she'd need to replace before winter. The house felt larger than it looked from outside, with high ceilings and solid, hardwood floors beneath layers of accumulated neglect. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, its mantel decorated with old photographs in frames that had once been silver. The furniture was sparse but sturdy, a couch that had probably been blue once, 2 mismatched chairs, and a coffee table marked with ring stains from countless forgotten cups. In the kitchen, she found her first surprise. Sitting on a scarred wooden table, positioned as if someone had placed it there just moments before her arrival, was a worn leather journal bound with a piece of twine. Her name was written on the cover in her grandfather's careful handwriting. For Mariel, when she's ready to understand. She picked up the journal with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of years in its pages. The leather was soft with age, molded by decades of handling. When she opened it, the scent of old paper and something else, pine, maybe, or earth after rain, drifted up to her. The first page contained a single line: "The deep earth keeps its secrets, but not forever." What followed were pages of notes written in her grandfather's precise script, mixed with sketches of property boundaries, geological formations, and diagrams she couldn't understand. Coordinates were scattered throughout, along with dates going back 30 years. Some pages contained what looked like scientific observations about soil composition and mineral content, while others held more personal reflections about the land, the town, and the neighbors who'd never quite understood him. One entry, dated just 6 months ago, caught her attention. They think I'm just the crazy old man who talks to rocks, but every rock has a story. Some stories are worth more than gold. Some are worth more than they can imagine. As evening settled over the property, Mariel lit the 3 candles she'd found in a kitchen drawer and continued reading by their flickering light. The electricity had been turned off months ago, and the propane tank was empty, but somehow the isolation felt protective rather than frightening. The journal revealed a complex man, nothing like the bitter hermit her family had described. Her grandfather wrote about the changing seasons with the reverence of someone who'd spent decades observing the subtle shifts of prairie weather. He documented the migration patterns of birds, the flowering cycles of wildflowers most people would call weeds, and the way morning light struck the hills differently as autumn gave way to winter. But threaded through these gentle observations was something else, a persistent curiosity about what lay beneath the surface of his land. References to deep surveys and mineral assessments appeared regularly, along with sketches of underground formations that suggested extensive research into the geology of the property. One sketch showed the farmhouse and barn from above, with dotted lines extending in all directions to mark property boundaries that seemed to stretch much farther than what she could see from the windows. Numbers were penciled beside various sections, but their meaning remained unclear. The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before his death. If something happens to me before I can finish this work, I hope the right person will find these notes and understand what they mean. The land will provide for those who truly need it, but only if they're brave enough to dig deeper than the surface. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose barn door and sending a long, mournful sound across the fields. Mariel closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling the baby kick in response to the motion. For the first time since arriving in Hornburn, she felt a connection to this place that went beyond desperation and legal documents. Tomorrow, she would explore the property more thoroughly. Tomorrow, she would figure out what her grandfather's cryptic notes meant and whether there was any truth to his hints about hidden value. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of turning this inheritance into the sanctuary she and her baby needed. But tonight, sitting in the candle-lit kitchen of a house that felt like it was slowly welcoming her home, Mariel allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everyone had been wrong about both her grandfather and the worthless property he'd left behind. The morning sun revealed Hornburn in all its small-town starkness, a collection of weathered buildings arranged along a single main street that looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1985. Mariel drove her Honda slowly past the hardware store, the diner, and the single traffic light that blinked yellow in all 4 directions, as if the town couldn't quite commit to stopping or going. She needed supplies, basic groceries, cleaning materials, and most urgently, prenatal vitamins. The baby had been restless all night, and she'd run out of the vitamins her doctor in Denver had prescribed weeks ago, before everything fell apart. The grocery store occupied a corner building with windows that advertised specials in handwritten signs. Ground beef $3.99 lb and sweet corn local $0.50 ear. A bell chimed as she pushed through the glass door, and immediately she felt the weight of curious stares from the other customers. 3 middle-aged women stood near the produce section, their conversation dying as Mariel walked past. She caught fragments of whispered words: pregnant, Henderson Place, poor thing, delivered with the kind of false sympathy that felt more like judgment. At the pharmacy counter in the back of the store, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. "You're the Henderson girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Mariel," she replied, placing her hands protectively over her belly. I need prenatal vitamins, please. We don't stock those, he said flatly. You'll have to drive to Selina for specialty items like that, about 60 miles east. A woman behind Mariel in line snorted softly. Might want to make that trip soon. Honey, that old house isn't fit for raising a child, probably full of mold and Lord knows what else. Mariel turned to face her, a woman in her 50s with carefully styled hair and makeup that seemed too elaborate for a Tuesday morning grocery. Run. I'm sorry, do I know you? Janet Whitmore, the woman said, extending a manicured hand that Mariel didn't take. I run the real estate office here in town. I knew your grandfather, God rest his soul. Sweet man, but not exactly practical when it came to property maintenance. The house is fine, Mariel said quietly. Janet's laugh was sharp. Oh, honey, I've had that property on my watch list for years. The roof needs replacing, the foundation has settling issues, and the well water probably isn't safe to drink. You're looking at $50,000 minimum just to make it habitable, and that's if you do most of the work yourself. The number hit Mariel like a physical blow. She had $37 in her wallet and maybe $200 in her checking account. The idea of $50,000 might as well have been 50 million. Of course, Janet continued, if you're looking to sell, I have several interested buyers. The land itself has potential, even if the structures are worthless. I could probably get you $15,000 for the whole parcel, which would give you a nice little nest egg to start fresh, somewhere more suitable for a young mother. $15,000 for 50 acres and a house that, despite its problems, felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived in years. The offer was insulting, but the desperation in her chest made it tempting. I'll think about it, Mariel managed, gathering her few purchases, generic pain relievers, bread, peanut butter, and a gallon of water she hoped was cleaner than whatever came from the well. The drive back to the farmhouse felt longer than the trip into town. Each mile stretched her anxiety thinner until she was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway, her hands were shaking. She sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the house that was supposed to be her salvation. Janet Whitmore was right about its condition. In daylight, the problems were even more obvious. Shingles were missing from the roof. The porch railing had gaps where boards had rotted away. The foundation stones were cracked in several places, allowing weeds to grow up through the gaps. What had she been thinking? That she could somehow make this work with no money and no experience, that this baby deserved to be born into a house that might not even have safe drinking water. As she was wrestling with these thoughts, a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Behind her, the car looked impossibly out of place against the rural backdrop, its polished surface reflecting the prairie sky like dark water. The woman who emerged was elegantly dressed in a way that probably cost more than Mariel had ever owned at one time. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer sunglasses, and a handbag that screamed expensive taste. It took Mariel a moment to recognize her, but when the woman removed her sunglasses, the identification was unmistakable. Victoria Ashford, her ex-boyfriend's mother. Mariel, Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of forced warmth that preceded a knife between the ribs. What a surprise to find you here. Jason mentioned you'd inherited some property, but I had no idea it was in such a rustic location. Mrs. Ashford. Mariel climbed out of her Honda slowly, using the car door to steady herself. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Oh, I was in the area on business. I represent several investment groups interested in agricultural properties in this region. Victoria's gaze swept over the farmhouse with obvious disdain. I have to say, darling, this place is even worse than I imagined. You can't seriously be planning to raise Jason's child here. The possessive way she said Jason's child made Mariel's stomach clench. This is my child and my property. Of course, dear, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. But you have to be practical. A young woman in your situation needs financial security, not sentimental attachments to worthless real estate. I spoke with Janet Whitmore this morning. She mentioned you might be considering a sale. The speed at which that information had traveled made Mariel's head spin. She'd spoken to Janet less than 2 hours ago. I'm prepared to make you an offer, Victoria continued. $25,000 cash for the entire property. That's $10,000 more than the local market value, and it would give you enough to find a suitable apartment in a city with proper medical facilities, somewhere appropriate for my grandchild's upbringing. The words hung in the air like a challenge. $25,000 would solve her immediate problems, but it would also mean admitting defeat. It would mean accepting that everyone was right about her inability to make it on her own. I need time to think, Mariel said. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Of course. But don't take too long, dear. Offers like this don't come around often, especially for properties in this condition. I'd hate for you to miss an opportunity that could secure your child's future. As the Mercedes disappeared down the county road, Mariel sank onto the porch steps and buried her face in her hands. The morning had stripped away her tentative optimism and replaced it with the harsh mathematics of reality. She was alone, pregnant, and nearly broke, trying to make a home in a house that needed more money than she would ever have. But as she sat there in the afternoon heat, her grandfather's journal pressed against her back through the screen door where she'd left it, something stubborn crystallized in her chest. Victoria Ashford's visit felt less like a generous offer and more like a predator circling wounded prey. Maybe the house was falling apart. Maybe the well water wasn't safe and the roof needed replacing. But it was hers, and it was the only thing, standing between her and complete dependence on people who had already proven they couldn't be trusted with her future. She pressed both hands against her belly and felt the baby respond with a strong kick, as if agreeing with her decision. We're staying, she whispered to the child growing inside her. Whatever it takes, we're making this work. The next morning brought a determination that surprised Mariel with its intensity. She woke before dawn, not from the baby's movements for once, but from a restless energy that demanded action. If she was going to make this work, if she was going to prove everyone wrong about both her and this property, she needed to understand exactly what she was fighting for. Armed with her grandfather's journal and a cup of coffee made from instant grounds and bottled water, she began a systematic exploration of the farmhouse. In the kitchen's top drawer, rolled up behind a collection of rubber bands and paper clips, she found something that made her catch her breath. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, rendered in her grandfather's meticulous draftsmanship. But unlike the official property boundaries shown in the legal documents, this map revealed a much larger territory. According to her grandfather's careful measurements, her inheritance extended nearly 3 times farther than she'd realized, stretching east to include a section of dense woodland and south to encompass what looked like an entire hillside. Strange symbols marked various locations across the expanded property. Small X's with numbers beside them, dotted lines that seemed to indicate underground features, and areas shaded with cross-hatching that suggested some kind of geological significance. At the bottom of the map, in faded ink, her grandfather had written, "Surface rights confirmed. Mineral Rights Research 1987-2023. See additional documentation." Additional documentation. Mariel spent the next hour searching every drawer and cabinet in the house, but found nothing else that seemed to relate to property rights or geological surveys. Whatever other papers her grandfather had collected, they weren't stored in the obvious places. By mid-morning, she'd worked up enough courage to venture into town again, this time to the county assessor's office, where she hoped to learn more about the property's official boundaries and tax status. The woman behind the counter, a tired-looking clerk named Brenda, was more helpful than anyone at the grocery store had been. "Henderson property, you said?" Brenda pulled up records on an ancient computer that hummed and clicked with each command. That's a big parcel, 58 acres according to our files, though there's been some confusion over the exact boundaries over the years. Confusion? Oh, the usual rural property disputes. Neighbor claims, survey discrepancies, that sort of thing. Your grandfather was pretty insistent about his property lines, especially toward the end. Came in here every few months asking about mineral rights and zoning regulations. Mariel leaned forward. Mineral rights. Most folks around here don't think about it, but mineral rights can be separate from surface rights. Your grandfather seemed to think there might be something valuable under his land, but he could never get the right permits to do any serious exploration. Brenda scrolled through more records. Looks like he filed dozens of applications over the years. Soil testing permits, geological survey requests, mining feasibility studies. Most of them were denied. Why denied? Brenda shrugged. Local zoning board probably thought he was getting eccentric in his old age. Plus, geological surveys are expensive and complicated. Takes a lot of paperwork to prove there's something worth digging for. The conversation stayed with Mariel as she drove back to the farmhouse, adding weight to the mystery her grandfather's journal had started. What had he been looking for under the property? And why had local officials been so resistant to letting him find it? That afternoon, she decided to walk the expanded boundaries shown on her grandfather's map, partly to verify their accuracy, and partly because sitting still had become impossible. The baby seemed more active when she was moving, settling into a comfortable rhythm that made her feel less like an unwelcome passenger in her own body. The walk revealed just how much of the property she hadn't seen from the house. Beyond the immediate yard, with its rusted equipment and overgrown garden, the land opened into natural prairie that rolled gently toward distant tree lines. Wildflowers dotted the grass, black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, and something that looked like wild bergamot, creating splashes of color against the green backdrop. Following the eastern boundary line from her grandfather's map, she discovered a section of woodland that was denser than it had appeared from a distance. Oak and hickory trees created a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into golden patches, and somewhere deeper in the woods she could hear the sound of running water. But it was near the southern hillside that she found something truly puzzling. Half hidden in the tall grass were what looked like metal surveyor's stakes, but instead of the bright orange flags typically used to mark property lines, these stakes were topped with small metal plates engraved with coordinates and numbers. They appeared to be positioned according to some kind of grid pattern, as if someone had been conducting systematic measurements across this section of the property. One stake bore a coordinate that matched an entry in her grandfather's journal, along with a notation that read, "Sample depth 15 feet, promising results, follow-up needed." Another was marked with what looked like a chemical formula, and the words, "Further analysis required." The implications were starting to form a picture that made Mariel's pulse quicken. Her grandfather hadn't been the aimless hermit everyone thought he was. He'd been conducting some kind of serious geological research on his own property, research that had been thorough enough to require precise coordinates and systematic sampling. The sun began to set. She made her way back to the farmhouse through sections of prairie that felt different now that she understood their potential significance. Every rise and hollow in the land seemed to hold secrets. Every unusual formation or color change in the soil might represent something valuable hidden beneath the surface. Back in the kitchen, she spread her grandfather's map across the table and compared it to her afternoon's discoveries. The metal stakes corresponded exactly to several of the X marks on his hand-drawn boundaries. The shaded areas aligned with sections of the hillside where the grass grew differently, suggesting variations in soil composition that might be geologically significant. But the most intriguing discovery came when she held the map up to the window as the last daylight faded. In the thin paper she could see additional markings that hadn't been visible under normal lighting, faint lines drawn in pencil that connected the various marked locations into what looked like a complex underground network. Her grandfather had been mapping something beneath the entire property, something extensive enough to require years of careful documentation and measurement. And judging by the repeated permit applications Brenda had mentioned, it was something valuable enough that he'd been willing to fight local bureaucracy for decades to explore it properly. The question was, what had he found down there that was worth 30 years of secretive research? And more importantly, was it valuable enough to secure her child's future and prove that everyone who dismissed this inheritance was wrong? As night settled over the farmhouse, Mariel felt a new kind of excitement building alongside her determination. She was no longer just fighting to make a failed property work. She was potentially sitting on top of her grandfather's greatest discovery, something that had been hiding in plain sight while the rest of Hornburn dismissed him as a harmless eccentric. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of uncovering whatever secrets lay beneath the surface. Tonight, she would plan her next moves and prepare for what might be the most important investigation of her life. The basement had been easy to miss during her first explorations of the house. Its entrance, hidden behind a narrow door, she'd assumed led to a coat closet. But following her grandfather's journal references to laboratory work and sample storage, Mariel had finally tried the old brass handle and discovered wooden steps descending into darkness. What she found below ground made her grandfather's surface eccentricities seem suddenly purposeful and methodical. The basement had been converted into a makeshift laboratory that would have impressed a professional geological survey team. Workbenches lined two walls, equipped with scales, measuring, devices and equipment she couldn't immediately identify. Above the benches, shelves held dozens of small glass vials, each carefully labeled with coordinates, dates, and brief notations about soil composition and mineral content. A closer inspection of the sample collection revealed the scope of her grandfather's research. Vials dated back to 1987 and continued right up until a few weeks before his death, suggesting 3 decades of systematic soil analysis across every section of the property. The labels recorded not just basic information, but detailed observations. Clay content high, iron oxide present, or unusual density recommend further testing, or most intriguingly, promising metallic traces verify with deep sample. In the locked file cabinet that opened with a key she found taped under one of the workbenches, Mariel discovered folders full of correspondence with geological survey companies, mineral rights lawyers, and university geology departments. The letters painted a picture of a man who had been trying desperately to get professional validation for discoveries he'd made on his own land. One letter from a geology professor at Kansas State University, dated just 2 years ago, was particularly revealing. Mr. Henderson, while I appreciate your enthusiasm and the thoroughness of your amateur research, I must again emphasize that proper geological assessment requires professional equipment and laboratory analysis that goes far beyond what can be accomplished with basic field testing. Your soil samples do show interesting mineral concentrations, but without comprehensive subsurface mapping and professional analysis, it's impossible to determine whether these concentrations represent anything of commercial value. I recommend you contact a licensed geological survey firm if you're serious about pursuing this matter further. But it was the professor's postscript that made Mariel's heart race. That said, the mineral traces you've documented are consistent with significant subsurface deposits. If your property boundaries are accurate and these concentrations continue at depth, you may indeed be sitting on something quite valuable. Other letters told the story of her grandfather's frustrated attempts to get permits for professional geological surveys. Local zoning boards had consistently denied his applications, citing concerns about environmental impact and property disruption. One particularly dismissive response from the county planning office suggested that amateur geological speculation was not sufficient grounds for approving expensive and potentially damaging survey work. The pattern that emerged was of a man who had made a significant discovery but been blocked at every turn from proving its value through official channels. His amateur research had been thorough enough to attract serious interest from academic geologists, but not official enough to overcome local bureaucratic resistance. As Mariel studied the correspondence, she began to notice something else troubling. Several letters referenced conversations and meetings that seemed to have happened outside the official permitting process. A mining company based in Colorado had apparently approached her grandfather directly, offering to purchase his property, sight unseen for significantly above market value. A land development firm had made multiple offers over the years, each higher than the last, despite the property's obvious surface limitations. Why would professional development companies be so interested in a rundown farmhouse and apparently worthless agricultural land? Unless they knew something about the property's subsurface value that the local community didn't. The implications made her reconsider every interaction she'd had since arriving in Hornburn. Janet Whitmore's eagerness to arrange a quick sale, Victoria Ashford's suspiciously generous offer, the county officials' consistent refusal to allow proper geological surveys. Even the grocery store clerk's hostility might make more sense if there were people in town who wanted to keep the property's true value hidden. Her afternoon was interrupted by a knock on the front door, the first visitor she'd had who actually announced their presence. Through the screen door, she saw a woman about her age, holding a covered dish, and wearing the kind of genuinely friendly expression that Mariel had almost forgotten existed. "Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh," the woman said. "I run the medical clinic here in town, and I heard we had someone new dealing with a pregnancy without proper medical support." Mariel opened the door, immediately grateful for the lack of judgment in the stranger's eyes. "I'm Mariel, and yes, I could definitely use medical support." "I thought so. Mind if I come in? I brought some soup and wanted to make sure you're taking care of yourself and the baby." Over the next hour, Dr. Walsh provided the kind of care Mariel had been craving since arriving in Hornburn. A quick but thorough examination revealed that both she and the baby were healthy, though she was showing signs of stress that needed attention. More importantly, Dr. Walsh offered practical support, samples of prenatal vitamins, information about local resources, and most valuably, someone to talk to who wasn't either judging her or trying to buy her property. "I knew your grandfather," Dr. Walsh mentioned as she packed up her medical bag. "He was actually one of my most interesting patients. Never had a serious illness, but he came in regularly for what he called occupational health monitoring." Occupational health? He was concerned about exposure to various minerals and chemicals from his geological work. Most people thought he was just playing around in the dirt, but he took it seriously enough to get regular blood tests to check for heavy metal exposure and other occupational hazards you'd normally associate with professional mining or geological work. This was the first confirmation Mariel had heard from someone in town that her grandfather's research might have been more serious than amateur hobby. "Did he ever mention finding anything significant?" Dr. Walsh hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "He was excited about something in the last year of his life. Kept talking about finally having proof of what he'd suspected for decades. But he also seemed worried about something. Kept asking me about confidentiality laws and whether I was legally required to report certain types of information." "What kind of information?" "I never found out. He died before our next appointment, and he never explained what he was concerned about." Dr. Walsh gathered her things to leave, then paused at the door. "But I will say this, your grandfather was one of the most methodical and intelligent men I've ever known. If he spent 30 years researching something on this property, I'd bet my medical license there was something here worth finding." As Dr. Walsh's car disappeared down the county road, Mariel stood in the doorway feeling more hopeful than she had since arriving in Hornburn. For the first time, She'd met someone who took her grandfather's work seriously and who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being rather than her property's potential sale value. But Dr. Walsh's comments about confidentiality laws and reporting requirements added a new layer of complexity to the mystery. What kind of discovery would require a doctor's discretion? What had her grandfather found that made him worry about legal obligations and official reporting? The answers, she was becoming convinced, lay somewhere in the remaining boxes and files she hadn't yet explored. Her grandfather had been building towards something in his final year, something important enough to cause him genuine concern about the implications. Whatever secrets were buried beneath this property, Mariel was determined to uncover them before anyone else could take away her chance to secure her child's future. The county library in Hornburn occupied a brick building that had once been a bank, complete with thick walls and high ceilings that made whispered conversations echo like secrets. Mariel spent the morning there researching mineral rights law and geological survey procedures, trying to understand why her grandfather's permit applications had been consistently denied. What she learned was troubling. According to Kansas state law, property owners had the right to conduct reasonable geological testing on their own land, especially when mineral rights were included in their deed. The permits her grandfather had been applying for, basic soil analysis, subsurface mapping, and mineral content assessment, should have been routine approvals for someone with clear property ownership and legitimate research purposes. The fact that local officials had blocked these applications for 30 years suggested either incompetence or deliberate interference. And given the letters she'd found in her grandfather's files, incompetence seemed less likely than active suppression. A stack of old newspapers in the library's periodical section provided additional context. Over the past decade, several articles had documented the quiet transformation of rural Kansas counties as energy companies and mineral extraction firms identified new sources of valuable deposits. Properties that had been worthless farmland for generations suddenly became worth millions when the right geological surveys revealed oil, natural gas, or rare earth minerals beneath the surface. One article from 3 years ago was particularly relevant. Local landowners strike it rich as lithium deposits transform rural counties. The piece described farmers who had become millionaires overnight when battery manufacturers started purchasing mineral rights to lithium-rich land for renewable energy production. Lithium, the word appeared several times in her grandfather's journal, though she hadn't understood its significance at the time. In the context of renewable energy and battery production, lithium deposits could indeed be worth the kind of money that would attract professional mining companies and unscrupulous local officials. She was copying down mineral rights information when someone sat down across from her at the library table, a man in his 50s, wearing a suit that was too expensive for Hornburn and carrying a briefcase that suggested serious business. "Miss Henderson," he said quietly, "I'm Richard Brennan, representing Hartwell Mining Corporation. I understand you've inherited the old Henderson property." Mariel closed the notebook she'd been writing in, instinctively protective of her research. "I'm not interested in selling. I haven't made an offer yet," Brennan said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I think you should hear what I have to say before you make any permanent decisions about that property." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with official-looking documents. "Hartwell Mining has been monitoring mineral deposits in this region for several years. We have reason to believe your property may contain subsurface resources of significant commercial value." The casual way he said it, as if her grandfather's decades of research were common knowledge, made Mariel's stomach clench. "What kind of resources?" "Lithium primarily, though our preliminary surveys suggest the possibility of other valuable minerals as well. The deposits appear to be extensive and of unusually high quality." He slid a document across the table. "This is a geological assessment we commissioned last year based on regional mineral mapping and subsurface analysis of properties adjacent to yours. The document was professionally prepared, with charts and graphs that looked far more sophisticated than anything in her grandfather's amateur laboratory. But the property boundaries shown in the survey were wrong. They included sections of land that definitely belonged to her grandfather's estate, not to neighboring properties. "You surveyed my land without permission," she said. Brennan's expression didn't change. "We surveyed publicly accessible areas using remote sensing technology. No trespassing was involved, I assure you. But the results suggest your property could be worth substantial money to the right buyer." He pulled out another document, a purchase offer that made Victoria Ashford's proposal look like pocket change. "Hartwell Mining is prepared to offer $800,000 for full mineral rights to your property, with an additional $200,000 if you're willing to sell the surface rights as well. $1 million total cash, with closing within 30 days. The numbers hit Mariel like a physical blow. $1 million would solve every problem she'd ever had and secure her child's future beyond any reasonable doubt. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having access to, enough to buy a house in any city she chose and provide educational opportunities she'd only dreamed of. But it was also confirmation that everyone who had dismissed her grandfather as a harmless eccentric had been wrong. The property they'd all considered worthless was valuable enough to attract $1 million offer from a professional mining corporation. "Why now?" she asked. "If these deposits have been here all along, why is your company just making an offer now?" Lithium prices have increased dramatically over the past few years due to electric vehicle production and renewable energy storage demands, Brennan explained. "Deposits that weren't economically viable a decade ago are now extremely valuable. Plus, recent changes in federal mining regulations have made it easier to develop rural properties for mineral extraction." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't the whole truth. "And my grandfather? Did your company ever approach him about selling?" "We attempted to open negotiations several times over the years, but Mr. Henderson was resistant to development opportunities. He seemed to have unrealistic expectations about conducting his own geological research rather than working with established mining professionals." The dismissive way Brennan described her grandfather's research made Mariel's anger flare. "Maybe he understood the value of his land better than you gave him credit for." "Perhaps, but understanding potential value and having the resources to realize that value are two different things. Your grandfather spent 30 years playing with soil samples, while the deposits beneath his property remained undeveloped and worthless. Hartwell Mining can turn those deposits into actual wealth within 18 months. Brennan leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Miss Henderson, I'm going to be frank with you. You're a young woman in a difficult situation, trying to make a life for yourself and your child in a property that requires substantial investment just to be habitable. Even if the mineral deposits are as valuable as we believe, developing them requires millions of dollars in equipment, environmental permits, and specialized expertise that could take years to acquire." He tapped the purchase offer. "This money is guaranteed and immediate. It would allow you to start fresh anywhere you choose, with complete financial security for both you and your baby. The alternative is spending years fighting through regulatory approvals and development costs, with no guarantee that you'll ever see a return on that investment." The practical logic of his argument was undeniable. She had no money, no experience with mineral development, and no idea how to navigate the complex legal and technical requirements of mining operations. Taking the $1 million would be the smart, safe choice that would secure her child's future without years of uncertainty and risk. But something about Brennan's eagerness made her hesitate. If Hartwell Mining was willing to pay $1 million immediately, what did they expect the property to be worth after development? And why had they been so interested in her grandfather's property for years if the deposits had only recently become economically viable? "I need time to consider the offer," she said. Brennan's professional smile faltered slightly. "Of course, but I should mention that this offer has a limited time frame. Market conditions in the lithium industry are volatile, and our company's development priorities could change if we don't move forward soon. How long do I have?" "2 weeks. After that, we'll need to pursue other properties in the region." He stood up and handed her a business card, along with the purchase documents. "I hope you'll make the decision that's best for your family's future, Miss Henderson. This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often." After he left, Mariel sat alone in the library, staring at the purchase offer and trying to process the implications. $1 million was more money than she'd ever imagined having, but it also represented validation of everything her grandfather had believed about the property's hidden value. The question was whether she had the courage and resources to bet her child's future on her ability to develop those deposits independently, or whether she should take the guaranteed money and walk away from whatever larger fortune might be buried beneath the prairie. As she gathered her research materials and prepared to leave, one detail from Brennan's geological survey caught her attention. The mineral concentration estimates were based on data from 2019, 4 years ago, which meant Hartwell Mining had been studying her grandfather's property long before his death. They had known about the deposits while he was still alive, while he was still being denied permits for his own geological research. They had watched him struggle with local bureaucracy for years, knowing all along that his amateur discoveries were accurate and valuable. The realization made her grandfather's isolation and frustration seem less like eccentric stubbornness and more like the response of a man who understood he was being deliberately excluded from developing his own land's resources. Walking back to her car, Mariel felt the weight of 2 different futures pressing against her chest. One offered immediate security and the chance to start over somewhere else. The other offered the possibility of honoring her grandfather's lifelong work and claiming the full value of what he'd discovered. But choosing the uncertain path would mean risking not just her own future but her child's as well. And she wasn't sure she had the right to make that gamble for both of them. The sleepless nights were taking their toll. Mariel found herself waking every few hours, not from physical discomfort, but from the weight of the decision she was facing. $1 million in guaranteed money against the uncertain promise of something potentially much larger. Her child's immediate security against her grandfather's lifetime of research and dedication. By the 4th day after Richard Brennan's visit, she'd worn a path in the farmhouse kitchen from pacing between the table where his offer lay and the window that looked out over fields that might hold the key to generational wealth. It was during one of these restless circuits that she noticed something she'd missed before. The kitchen wall adjacent to the basement door had an unusual discoloration, a rectangular patch where the paint was slightly different, as if something had been mounted there for years and recently removed. Examination revealed 4 small nail holes in a pattern that suggested a picture frame or document holder. But more interestingly, running her hands along the wall revealed a slight depression in the plaster, as if the wall had been patched and repainted to cover some kind of opening. Armed with a flashlight and a butter knife from the kitchen drawer, Mariel began carefully probing the suspicious area. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing that this section of wall was much newer than the rest of the kitchen. Within an hour of careful work, she'd exposed the edges of what appeared to be a concealed panel. Behind the false wall, her grandfather had created a hiding place that held the most important documents of his lifelong research. The space was small but carefully organized, containing a metal document box that had been protected from moisture and decay. Inside, Mariel found geological surveys that made her amateur research look elementary by comparison. Professional assessment reports, commissioned privately over the years from consulting firms in Colorado and Texas, detailed extensive mineral deposits beneath the entire property. Lithium was indeed present, but it was only part of a much larger picture. The reports documented rare earth elements, copper, and most significantly, an extensive natural gas reserve that extended deep beneath the prairie surface. But it was the most recent document in the collection that made her hands tremble as she read it. Dated just 6 months before her grandfather's death, it was a comprehensive property valuation prepared by an independent geological consulting firm. According to their analysis, the total estimated value of mineral deposits beneath the property was $120 million. $120 million. The number was so large it seemed abstract, like a figure from a news report about corporate acquisitions or government budgets, rather than something that could belong to a pregnant woman sitting alone in a farmhouse kitchen. The valuation report included detailed breakdowns of extraction costs, market value projections, and development timelines, even accounting for the substantial expenses involved in bringing the deposits to market. The net value to the property owner was estimated at between $70 and $90 million. Hartwell Mining's offer of $1 million suddenly looked less like generosity and more like theft. A letter clipped to the valuation report, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting, provided context for the hidden documents. If you're reading this, it means I didn't live long enough to complete the work I started 30 years ago. The local officials who blocked my permit applications weren't incompetent. They were protecting the interests of people who wanted to acquire this land for far less than its true value. I've documented everything I could about the deposits beneath our family's property, but I couldn't find a way to develop them without exposing myself to legal challenges from people with more resources and connections than I had. I hope whoever inherits this land will have the courage and wisdom to claim its full value rather than accepting the lowball offers that will certainly come. The deposits are real, the valuations are accurate, and the potential for generational wealth is genuine. But be careful, there are people who have been waiting for years to get their hands on this property, and they won't give up easily once they realize you know what it's really worth. The letter was signed simply Benjamin Henderson and dated 2 weeks before his death. Mariel sat in the kitchen as afternoon faded to evening, surrounded by documents that transformed her understanding of everything that had happened since her arrival in Hornburn. Her grandfather hadn't been an eccentric hermit. He'd been a man sitting on a fortune who couldn't find a way to claim it safely. Janet Whitmore's eagerness to arrange a quick sale, Victoria Ashford's suspiciously generous offer, the county officials' consistent denial of research permits, even Richard Brennan's urgent timeline for accepting Hartwell Mining's purchase offer. All of it made sense now as part of a coordinated effort to acquire the property before she could discover its true value, but understanding the scope of what she'd inherited also brought a new level of fear. $70 to $90 million was enough money to change her life completely, but it was also enough money to make powerful people willing to do almost anything to take it away from her. The documents included contact information for the geological consulting firm that had prepared the valuation, along with lawyers who specialized in mineral rights development and independent mining companies that might serve as alternatives to the established corporations already trying to pressure her into selling. For the first time since arriving in Hornburn, Mariel had a clear path forward, but it was a path that would put her in direct conflict with people who had been maneuvering for years to control her property's resources. As she carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, replacing the false wall panel and touching up the paint to conceal any signs of her discovery, Mariel felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a heavy coat. She wasn't just making a decision about her own future anymore. She was deciding whether to honor her grandfather's lifetime of work and claim what he'd been systematically prevented from developing. She was choosing between immediate safety and the kind of generational wealth that could transform not just her child's life, but the lives of children not yet born. But she was also choosing to fight people who had proven they were willing to use official channels, financial pressure, and coordinated manipulation to get what they wanted. People who had been patient enough to wait 30 years for her grandfather to die, rather than find a legal way to buy him out at fair value. The baby kicked strongly as she stood up from the kitchen table, as if responding to her mother's racing pulse and heightened emotions. Mariel placed both hands on her belly and felt the life growing inside her, the future that would be shaped by whatever decision she made in the coming days. "What would you do?" she asked the child, knowing the question was really meant for herself. "Would you take the safe money, or would you fight for everything Grandpa Benjamin believed this place could provide?" The answer, she was beginning to realize, wasn't just about money. It was about whether she had the courage to claim her family's legacy and prove that the people who had counted her out were wrong about both her strength and her grandfather's dreams. The letter was waiting for her on the kitchen table when she returned from town the next morning, placed exactly where she'd been sitting the night before while studying her grandfather's hidden documents. Someone had been in the house while she was gone. Her name was written across the envelope in her grandfather's familiar handwriting, but the paper was different, newer than the aged documents she'd found behind the false wall. Inside was a single sheet that made her hands shake as she read it. "Mariel, if you're reading this, it means two things. You've found the documents I hid, and you've stayed long enough for the people watching you to become worried about what you might discover. This letter was left with specific instructions to be delivered only if certain conditions were met. You're in more danger than you realize, but you also have more allies than you know. The family rift that kept you away from me wasn't accidental. Your parents were told things about me that weren't true, stories designed to isolate me from anyone who might inherit this property and understand its value. I never stopped loving you or thinking about your future, but I couldn't risk bringing you into the situation I was facing until I could find a way to protect you. I always intended for you to inherit everything, but I also intended to be here to help you navigate the challenges that would come with claiming your inheritance. Since I won't be able to guide you through this personally, I've arranged for help from people you can trust. Dr. Jennifer Walsh has been more than my physician. She's been documenting evidence of the conspiracy to suppress development of this property. The law firm of Patterson and Associates in Topeka has been retained on your behalf and has copies of all the geological reports and evidence of official misconduct. Most importantly, I've been working with an independent mining consortium that specializes in protecting small landowner rights against corporate manipulation. You don't have to fight this battle alone, and you don't have to accept lowball offers from people who have been planning to steal your inheritance for years. But you do need to be careful. The people involved in this conspiracy have been patient enough to wait for my death, but they won't be patient much longer now that you're here. Trust Dr. Walsh. Call the lawyers. And remember that sometimes the most valuable thing we can leave our children isn't money, but the proof that they come from people who don't give up when the fight gets hard. With love and hope for your future, Grandpa Benjamin. P.S. The most important documents aren't in the house. Check the old oak tree near the eastern property line, the one with the metal plate nailed to it. Look for loose bark about 6 feet up on the north side. Mariel read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Her grandfather had anticipated this moment, planned for her arrival, and arranged support systems she didn't even know existed. But he'd also confirmed her growing suspicions about the level of coordination involved in suppressing the property's development. The family arguments that had kept her away from her grandfather for most of her life hadn't been the result of personality conflicts or generational differences. They'd been deliberately engineered to isolate him from potential heirs who might interfere with whatever long-term plan had been designed around his property. More disturbing was the implication that someone had been monitoring her activities, closely enough to know exactly when to deliver this letter. They'd known she'd found the hidden documents, known she'd discovered the property's true value, and known she was at the point where she needed additional information to move forward safely. The idea that she'd been under surveillance since arriving in Hornburn was terrifying, but it also explained several incidents that had puzzled her. The way information had traveled so quickly between Janet Whitmore and Victoria Ashford, the timing of Richard Brennan's approach at the library, even the carefully casual way various townspeople had questioned her about her plans for the property. She wasn't just dealing with opportunistic buyers trying to acquire undervalued land. She was dealing with a coordinated effort that had been years in the making, involving local officials, outside corporations, and possibly even members of her own extended family. But her grandfather had also been planning and preparing. The law. The firm he'd mentioned, Patterson and Associates, was well known for representing rural landowners against energy companies and mining corporations. Dr. Walsh's involvement explained her unusual interest in Mariel's well-being and her detailed knowledge of her grandfather's work. Most importantly, an independent mining consortium meant she had alternatives to the manipulative offers she'd been receiving. The walk to the eastern property line took 20 minutes through prairie grass that was beginning to turn golden with the approaching season change. The oak tree was exactly where her grandfather had described it, ancient and massive, with a metal survey marker nailed to its trunk about 8 feet above the ground. Finding the loose bark section required careful examination, but once she located it, a piece of bark about the size of a dinner plate lifted away to reveal a waterproof container wedged into a natural hollow in the tree trunk. Inside was a collection of documents that made everything she'd discovered so far seem like preparation for the real revelation. Legal papers showed that her grandfather had quietly been purchasing adjacent properties over the past decade, often through intermediaries and shell companies, to avoid drawing attention to his activities. The mineral rights he'd been researching didn't just extend under his original 58 acres. They covered nearly 300 acres of contiguous territory that he'd been systematically acquiring whenever neighboring properties went up for sale. The geological surveys covered this entire expanded territory, revealing mineral deposits that were even more extensive and valuable than the reports she'd found in the house. But more importantly, these documents showed that her grandfather had successfully filed mineral rights claims with the federal government, bypassing local officials who had been blocking his applications. A partnership agreement with Rocky Mountain Mineral Development, the independent mining consortium mentioned in his letter, outlined a development plan that would allow Mariel to retain majority ownership while providing the technical expertise and capital necessary to bring the deposits to market. According to their projections, her share of the eventual revenue would be approximately $100 million. But the most shocking revelation was contained in a folder marked Evidence of Conspiracy. Her grandfather had been documenting the coordination between local officials, Hartwell Mining, and various intermediaries for over 5 years. Recorded phone conversations, copied emails, and financial records showed a systematic effort to suppress property values in the region, while mining companies quietly acquired mineral rights through intimidation, manipulation, and official corruption. The conspiracy included county planning officials who had been receiving payments from mining companies in exchange for denying geological survey permits. It included local real estate agents who had been steering property sales toward predetermined buyers. It even included family members who had been paid to create conflicts that would isolate property owners from potential allies or heirs. Victoria Ashford's name appeared throughout the documents, not as Jason's mother making a generous offer, but as a paid representative of Hartwell Mining who had been tasked with acquiring the Henderson property through whatever means necessary. Her relationship with Jason hadn't been coincidental. It had been part of a long-term strategy to gain access to Mariel and potentially influence her inheritance decisions. The scope of the deception was breathtaking, but so was the thoroughness of her grandfather's documentation. He'd spent the final years of his life building a legal case that could expose the entire conspiracy while protecting his heirs' rights to the property's full value. As Mariel sat beneath the oak tree, surrounded by evidence of both betrayal and preparation, she realized that her grandfather had given her something more valuable than mineral deposits. He'd given her the tools to fight back against people who had underestimated both his intelligence and her determination. The battle for her inheritance was just beginning, but for the first time since arriving in Hornburn, she wasn't facing it alone. Dr. Walsh arrived within an hour of Mariel's phone call, bringing with her a sense of urgency that confirmed the gravity of the situation. Behind her came two men in professional suits who introduced themselves as attorneys from Patterson and Associates, along with a woman who identified herself as Rebecca Stone from Rocky Mountain Mineral Development. "Your grandfather chose his allies carefully," Dr. Walsh said as they gathered around the kitchen table with the documents spread before them. "We've all been waiting for this moment, though we'd hoped Benjamin would be here to guide you through it personally." James Patterson, the lead attorney, reviewed the conspiracy evidence with the practiced eye of someone who specialized in corporate malfeasance cases. "This is extraordinary documentation," he said. "Your grandfather essentially built a federal case against an organized effort to defraud mineral rights owners across 3 counties. With this evidence, we can not only protect your property rights, but potentially recover damages from the parties involved in the conspiracy." Rebecca Stone, meanwhile, was examining the geological surveys with obvious excitement. "These deposits are even more extensive than we initially believed. The lithium alone would be worth $40 million at current market prices, but the rare earth elements could be worth twice that much. Your grandfather was sitting on one of the most valuable undeveloped mineral sites in the Midwest. The problem," Dr. Walsh interjected, "is that our opponents know we've reached this point. They've been monitoring Mariel's activities, and they know she's discovered the truth about the property's value. They're going to escalate their pressure to acquire the land before we can move forward with legitimate development." As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel driveway made everyone look toward the windows. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the farmhouse, followed by Richard Brennan's sedan and Janet Whitmore's real estate office. "Car, showtime," Patterson murmured, gathering the most sensitive documents into his briefcase. "Remember, you don't have to agree to anything today. We have legal protections in place, and they know it." The group that approached the front door was more intimidating than Mariel had expected. Brennan led the way, but behind him were men who looked less like mining company representatives and more like corporate enforcement specialists. Janet Whitmore brought up the rear, her usual enthusiasm replaced by nervous energy that suggested she understood the stakes had been raised. "Miss Henderson," Brennan said when she opened the door, his professional smile strained. "I understand you've been getting advice from various parties about our generous offer. I wanted to make sure you understood the time-sensitive nature of the opportunity we've presented." "I've been doing research," Mariel replied, aware of her legal team positioned strategically behind her. "I've learned a lot about the property's actual value." "I'm sure you have, but I'm also sure you've been given unrealistic expectations about the complexity and cost of mineral development. The offer we've made accounts for those realities in a way that protects you from the substantial risks involved in independent development." James Patterson stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan, I'm representing Miss Henderson in this matter. Your client's previous offers have been based on incomplete information about the property's mineral rights and development potential. We're prepared to proceed with independent development that will provide substantially greater returns for the property owner." The change in Brennan's demeanor was immediate and unsettling. The professional courtesy disappeared, replaced by something harder and more threatening. Mr. Patterson, I think you'll find that independent development of this property will face substantial regulatory and legal challenges. Local zoning requirements, environmental impact assessments, and permit approval processes can take years to navigate successfully, not when those processes have been deliberately manipulated to prevent legitimate development, Patterson replied calmly. We have extensive documentation of official misconduct and corporate conspiracy that will be presented to federal authorities within the week. One of the men behind Brennan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested significant corporate backing. Miss Henderson, I think you should understand that rejecting reasonable offers in favor of speculative development schemes carries significant personal and financial risks. Young women in your situation need security, not uncertainty. The veiled threat in his words made Dr. Walsh step protectively closer to Mariel. Are you threatening a pregnant woman, Mr. Davidson? And I'm not threatening anyone. I'm pointing out practical realities that need to be considered when making decisions that will affect not just Miss Henderson, but her unborn child. Rebecca Stone had been quietly observing the exchange, but now she spoke with the confidence of someone representing serious financial backing. Miss Henderson has already signed preliminary agreements with Rocky Mountain Mineral Development for professional extraction services. We have federal permits pending and environmental assessments scheduled to begin next week. The development timeline is well established and backed by substantial resources. This was news to Mariel, but she understood it was a strategic move, designed to demonstrate that she wasn't negotiating from a position of weakness. The surprised looks on the faces of Brennan's team suggested the strategy was working. Additionally, Patterson added, we'll be filing complaints with federal authorities regarding the systematic suppression of mineral rights development in this region. The documentation we've gathered suggests violations of federal mining law and potentially criminal conspiracy charges. Brennan's facade cracked completely. You're making a serious mistake, Miss Henderson. This property has been earmarked for development by established mining interests for several years. Independent operators who interfere with those plans often find themselves facing costly legal challenges that can drag on for decades. Is that a threat? Dr. Walsh asked sharply. It's a statement of fact. Small operators rarely have the resources to fight extended legal battles against well-established corporations with substantial legal departments. Good thing she's not a small operator, then, Rebecca Stone said, with a smile that was all business. Rocky Mountain Mineral Development has successfully defended mineral rights claims against major corporations in 4 states. We specialize in protecting independent landowner interests against exactly the kind of corporate intimidation you're describing. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes, with Brennan's team making increasingly aggressive arguments for accepting their offer, while Mariel's legal team calmly dismantled each pressure tactic with references to federal law and documented evidence of misconduct. Finally, Brennan played what was apparently his final card. Miss Henderson, I should inform you that if you proceed with this misguided course of action, you may find that certain information about your personal circumstances becomes part of the public record. Young women who find themselves in difficult situations sometimes discover that their past decisions attract unwanted scrutiny. The room went dead silent. Dr. Walsh's face flushed with anger, while Patterson looked like a predator who had just been handed the perfect weapon. Mr. Brennan, Patterson said quietly, did you just threaten to engage in character assassination against my client if she refuses to accept your below-market offer for her property? I stated a fact about public record information. You made a threat that we have multiple witnesses to document. That threat, combined with the other evidence we've gathered, will be presented to federal authorities as part of our complaint regarding criminal conspiracy to defraud mineral rights owners. As Brennan and his team finally retreated to their vehicles. Mariel felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. But along with the physical discomfort came something else, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. They had underestimated her grandfather for 30 years, dismissing him as an eccentric old man while he quietly built an unassailable case against their illegal activities. Now they were making the same mistake with her, assuming that threats and intimidation would overwhelm a young woman who had nowhere else to turn. But she wasn't just a desperate pregnant woman anymore. She was Benjamin Henderson's granddaughter, armed with his research, his legal preparations, and his absolute conviction that the people who had stolen from her family for years could be defeated by patience, preparation, and the courage to fight for what was right. The battle was about to begin in earnest, but for the first time since arriving in Hornburn, Mariel was ready for it. The federal complaint was filed at exactly 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Brennan's intimidation attempt. By 11:30 a.m., Mariel was in the emergency room at Salina Regional Medical Center, experiencing contractions that were coming. Too fast and too early. It's stress-induced, Dr. Walsh explained, as she monitored Mariel's vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. Your body is responding to the emotional and physical tension of the past week. We need to get these contractions under control, or we're looking at premature labor at 34 weeks. Through the haze of pain and fear, Mariel was dimly aware of activity beyond the hospital room. James Patterson had arrived and was conducting hushed phone conversations in the hallway. Rebecca Stone was coordinating with federal investigators who wanted to interview Mariel about her grandfather's documentation. And somewhere in the administrative chaos, word had gotten out that the Henderson mineral rights case was moving forward despite attempts to suppress it. The IV medication gradually slowed the contractions, but Dr. Walsh's expression remained concerned. We've stabilized the immediate situation, but you're going to need complete bed rest for at least the next 2 weeks. Any additional stress could trigger labor that we might not be able to stop. I can't stay in bed for 2 weeks, Mariel protested weakly. There are too many things that need to be handled with the legal case and the mineral rights development. The legal case can proceed without you being physically present for every meeting, Patterson said from the doorway. Your grandfather's documentation is so thorough that your testimony, while valuable, isn't essential for the initial phases of the federal investigation. But even as he spoke, they could hear commotion in the hospital corridor. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and what sounded like an argument between hospital security and people demanding access to Mariel's room. Dr. Walsh moved to close the door, but it was pushed open by Janet Whitmore, followed by 2 men Mariel didn't recognize. Miss Henderson, Janet said breathlessly, there's been a development in the situation with your property. The county planning office has discovered irregularities in your grandfather's mineral rights filings, and there are questions about the validity of your inheritance claims. Patterson stepped between Janet and Mariel's hospital bed. Mrs. Whitmore, my client is under medical care and cannot be disturbed with business matters at this time. This isn't business. It's urgent legal information. The county attorney is preparing to file a challenge to the Henderson estate proceedings based on evidence that Benjamin Henderson may have fraudulently filed mineral rights claims using forged documentation. The accusation hit Mariel like a physical blow, triggering a new wave of contractions that made the monitoring equipment alarm urgently. Dr. Walsh immediately began adjusting IV medications while shooting furious looks at the unwelcome visitors. You need to leave immediately, she ordered. This patient is in active labor management, and your presence is causing dangerous stress responses. But Janet pressed forward with her message. The county is prepared to freeze all assets related to the Henderson estate until the validity of the mineral rights claims can be verified through independent investigation. That means the property, the development agreements, everything will be tied up in legal proceedings that could last for years. Rebecca Stone appeared in the doorway, her professional composure strained. "James, we need to talk. The federal investigators are asking about irregularities in the documentation we submitted. Someone has been feeding them information that contradicts the evidence we gathered from Benjamin Henderson's files. Through the chaos of medical alarms, legal threats, and institutional pressure, Mariel felt something crystallize in her chest that was stronger than fear or pain. These people were using her medical emergency as an opportunity to overwhelm her. With legal challenges they hoped would force her to abandon her claims rather than fight through extended court proceedings. But they had miscalculated something fundamental about both her character and her resources. Her grandfather had anticipated this exact scenario, a coordinated attack designed to coincide with maximum personal vulnerability, and he had prepared defenses they didn't know about. "The safe," she managed to say between contractions. "Doctor Walsh, you need to go to the farmhouse. Behind the false wall in the kitchen, there's a safe. The combination is my birthday, month, day, year. Inside are the original mineral rights filings and the federal registration numbers that prove everything we submitted is legitimate." She looked directly at Janet Whitmore, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "My grandfather knew you would try something like this. He knew you were working with Hartwell Mining to suppress legitimate mineral rights claims, and he documented every illegal action you and the county planning office took to prevent him from developing his own property." The monitoring equipment showed her heart rate spiking dangerously, but her voice remained steady. "The federal investigators aren't asking about irregularities in our documentation. They're asking about irregularities in the county records that were altered to hide the fact that my grandfather's mineral rights claims were filed legally and approved years ago." Janet's face went pale, confirming what Mariel had suspected. The county's challenge to the estate wasn't based on newly discovered evidence. It was a desperate attempt to create legal confusion that would delay the federal investigation long enough for the conspiracy participants to destroy evidence or disappear. Patterson was already on his phone, coordinating with federal authorities who apparently had more information about the situation than anyone in the room had realized. Rebecca Stone was taking notes that would become part of an expanded federal case that now included obstruction of justice and tampering with public records. As Dr. Walsh finally succeeded in clearing the room and stabilizing Mariel's condition, the sound of sirens in the hospital parking lot suggested that the battle for her inheritance had escalated beyond civil litigation into criminal law enforcement territory. The contractions were subsiding, but the fight was just beginning. The FBI agents arrived at the hospital just as Dr. Walsh was administering the final round of medications to completely stop Mariel's premature labor. Special Agent Caroline Foster introduced herself with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested serious federal interest in the case rather than routine investigation. "Miss Henderson, I want you to know that your grandfather's documentation has been extraordinarily helpful in uncovering what appears to be a multi-state conspiracy to defraud mineral rights owners. We've been investigating similar patterns in Colorado and Wyoming, but the evidence he collected provides the missing connections we needed." Through the remaining effects of the labor-stopping medication, Mariel felt a surge of pride in her grandfather's meticulous preparation. "How extensive is the conspiracy?" "More extensive than we initially realized. Hartwell Mining has been systematically identifying valuable mineral deposits through illegal survey activities, then using networks of local officials, real estate agents and legal intermediaries to acquire properties for far below their actual value. Your grandfather's property was just one target in a scheme that has defrauded landowners out of an estimated $400 million over the past decade." Agent Foster pulled out a tablet showing a map of the central United States dotted with red markers. Each of these represents a property where we've documented suspicious acquisition patterns, permit denials, or other irregularities that match the methods used against your grandfather. But in most cases, the landowners eventually sold their properties without realizing they were being systematically cheated. What makes our case different? Your grandfather didn't give up, and he documented everything. Most importantly, he filed his mineral rights claims through federal channels when local officials blocked his applications. That means he established legal ownership of the mineral deposits independent of local interference, which makes the conspiracy participants vulnerable to federal fraud and racketeering charges. Dr. Walsh, who had been quietly monitoring Mariel's condition throughout the conversation, looked up from the fetal heart rate monitor with visible relief. The contractions have completely stopped, and both mother and baby are stable. Whatever medication combination we used this time, it worked perfectly. The timing felt symbolic. Just as her medical crisis was resolving, the legal crisis that had triggered it was also reaching a turning point that strongly favored her position. "There's something else," Agent Foster continued. "We've been monitoring communications between the conspiracy participants since your legal team filed the federal complaint. The pressure they've been putting on you over the past week wasn't just about getting you to sell the property quickly. It was about preventing you from discovering information that would expose their operations in other states." She showed Mariel recordings and transcripts that revealed the scope of panic among the people who had been trying to acquire her inheritance. Phone calls between Hartwell Mining executives discussing the need to contain the Henderson situation before it unraveled their broader operations. Emails between county officials and corporate representatives coordinating the estate challenge. As a delaying tactic, even recorded conversations with Victoria Ashford discussing more aggressive methods of pressuring Mariel to accept a settlement. Victoria Ashford isn't just your ex-boyfriend's mother, Agent Foster explained. She's been working as a paid acquisition specialist for Hartwell Mining for over 5 years, specifically targeting properties where personal relationships could be used to influence inheritance decisions. Her relationship with Jason was part of a long-term strategy to gain access to you and potentially manipulate your inheritance choices. The revelation should have been devastating, but instead it felt liberating. The personal betrayals that had seemed so painful, Jason's abandonment, his family's rejection, the isolation she'd felt since discovering her pregnancy, hadn't been about her personal failures or inadequacies. They'd been calculated moves in a corporate strategy designed to make her vulnerable to financial manipulation. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we finish the investigation and proceed with federal prosecution. Your mineral rights are secure, your inheritance is protected, and the development agreements you've signed with Rocky Mountain Mineral Development will proceed without interference. More importantly, the evidence we've gathered will help us recover damages for other landowners who were defrauded by this conspiracy." Patterson, who had been coordinating with federal investigators throughout the medical emergency, returned to the hospital room with documents that finalized the immediate legal protections. "The county's challenge to your estate has been withdrawn. The mineral rights development can proceed on schedule, and Hartwell Mining has agreed to settle fraud claims for an undisclosed amount that I think you'll find quite satisfactory." "How satisfactory?" "Let's just say your grandfather's decision to document everything thoroughly is going to result in punitive damages that make the mineral deposits themselves seem almost secondary." As the sun set outside the hospital windows, Mariel felt the baby settle into a peaceful rhythm that mirrored her own sense of resolution. The contractions were gone, the legal threats had been neutralized, and the people who had tried to steal her inheritance were facing federal prosecution instead. But more than that, she understood now that her grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the mineral deposits beneath the prairie, or even the documentation that protected her legal rights. His greatest gift had been the example of someone who refused to give up when powerful people tried to take what belonged to him, someone who chose courage and preparation over surrender and despair. She was Benjamin Henderson's granddaughter, and she came from people who didn't quit when the fight got hard. Her child would grow up knowing that legacy and someday would inherit not just the financial security the mineral deposits provided, but the knowledge that their family had fought for justice and won. 6 months later, the farmhouse stood transformed, but not betrayed by its renovation. The same strong bones that had weathered decades of prairie storms now supported modern windows, a sound roof, and fresh paint that honored the original architecture, while making the structure worthy of the fortune hidden beneath its foundations. Mariel sat on the restored front porch, her 3-month-old daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching the morning light illuminate fields that would soon be developed in a way that preserved their essential character while unlocking their extraordinary value. The mineral extraction would be conducted in phases, allowing sections of the prairie to remain undisturbed, while others provided the resources that had made her one of the wealthiest young women in Kansas. Dr. Walsh's car appeared on the county road, followed by the familiar vehicles of the legal and development teams who had become like family during the months of federal investigation and preparation for mineral extraction. Their weekly meetings had evolved from crisis management sessions into strategic planning discussions about how to use unprecedented wealth responsibly. "How's our little heiress doing?" Dr. Walsh asked, settling into the porch chair that had become her regular spot during these gatherings. "She slept through the night for the first time," Mariel said, unable to keep the pride and relief out of her voice. "I think she's finally adjusting to the idea that we're safe here, that this is really home." The baby's name was Rebecca Benjamin Henderson Stone, honoring both the mining development specialist who had protected their interests and the grandfather whose vision had made everything possible. She would grow up knowing that her security came not from luck or charity, but from the courage and persistence of people who had refused to give up when others tried to take what belonged to them. James Patterson emerged from his car carrying the folder that had become a symbol of their victory, the final federal court decision that had resulted in criminal convictions for 12 people involved in the mineral rights fraud conspiracy, including Richard Brennan, Janet Whitmore, and 3 county planning officials. Victoria Ashford had received a suspended sentence in exchange for her cooperation in exposing similar schemes in other states. "The punitive damage settlements have been finalized," he announced, spreading documents across the porch table. "Between the federal court awards and the separate civil settlements, the total compensation package comes to $47 million, in addition to the mineral extraction revenue projections." The numbers had long since stopped seeming real. To Mariel, $47 million in damages, plus an estimated $90 million from mineral extraction over the next decade, represented more money than she could meaningfully conceptualize. But what felt real and important was the way that money was being used to transform not just her life, but the lives of other people who had been victims of similar schemes. Rebecca Stone's latest report showed that the Henderson Foundation for Rural Property Rights had successfully helped 38 families recover stolen mineral rights and receive fair compensation for valuable deposits on their land. The foundation's legal support had prevented an estimated $200 million in additional fraud, while creating a model for protecting small landowners against corporate manipulation. "There's something else," Patterson continued, his tone suggesting good news. "The federal prosecution team has identified additional properties in Nebraska and Oklahoma where the same methods were used. They're asking if the foundation would be interested in expanding its operations to help those landowners as well." "Of course," Mariel said without hesitation. "That's exactly what Grandpa Benjamin would have wanted, using what happened here to protect other families from going through the same thing." The morning's business discussions gradually gave way to more personal conversations as the development team shared lunch and updates about their families. These people had become her chosen family during the months when her biological family was absent, and their continuing presence in her life represented something more valuable than any financial settlement. Dr. Walsh had become little Rebecca's godmother and Mariel's closest friend. Patterson's legal firm now specialized in rural property rights cases, using the expertise they'd developed during the Henderson case to protect other families. Rebecca Stone's mining development company had pioneered environmentally sensitive extraction methods that preserved agricultural land while developing mineral resources. As afternoons settled over the prairie, Mariel walked her visitors to their cars and then returned to the porch, where her grandfather's journal lay open beside her rocking chair. She'd been reading it aloud to baby Rebecca during their quiet moments, sharing the wisdom and observations of the man who had made their security possible. One passage had become her favorite, written during the early years of her grandfather's research when he was just beginning to understand what lay beneath the surface of his land. The earth keeps its secrets, but not forever. Patience, careful work, and the willingness to dig deeper than most people think necessary will eventually reveal treasures that have been waiting for the right person to discover them. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in places that everyone else has dismissed as worthless. The baby stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to focus on her mother's face with recognition and trust. In a few years, Rebecca would be old enough to hear the story of how her great-grandfather's determination had secured not just their financial future, but their family's reputation for courage in the face of powerful people who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. But she would also learn that wealth came with responsibilities. The money that had transformed their lives was being used to transform the lives of others who faced similar challenges. The legal precedents they'd established were protecting families across the country from corporate fraud. The foundation that bore her great-grandfather's name was ensuring that his legacy extended far beyond the mineral deposits he'd discovered beneath the Kansas prairie. As the sun set over land that had been dismissed as worthless but was now recognized as one of the most valuable mineral sites in the Midwest, Mariel felt the deep satisfaction that came from honoring both her grandfather's memory and her daughter's future. She had proven that people were wrong to count her out, and she had discovered that she held the key not just to financial security, but to the kind of generational change that would echo through decades of family history yet to be written.